Hi, everybody. How are you? Decided that I needed to respond to the recent New York Times thing. Musical people will know. It's one of those subjects where I'm sure some would say, "Well, what else needs to be said?" Um, but I think there is. I really do. I was, like no bones about it. I was very pleased with seeing the Rick Beato response. And I'm sure for some people, Rick represents, the angry old guy, waving his finger. And I try very hard, I think a degree of self-awareness, right? You try very hard not to be that person. And I think the thing for me that I try to keep in mind is, you know, where we are in this continuum. You understand your own place. Are you the right messenger for such and such a message? But I think, we're all going to go through this. So you'd like to think that you realize times have changed and you can be accepting of that to some degree. But it's also, I think, important to note what has changed. Some of the changes are inevitably good, and some of the changes aren't so great sometimes. Um, and I think the thing that makes it the old man waving his finger is when someone says something and they connect themselves personally to the run of events. My generation did this, or my generation didn't do this. I try very hard not to do that because I don't think it's true or honest. It doesn't comport with reality. Virtually every generation has made some sort of mistake or made some sort of error. Um, I don't, if things went well at a particular time, it had nothing to do with me. I just happened to be able to be around to witness it. Um, and a lot of the things that I think were were going well in some respects had nothing to do with my generation. It's not things were better when I was a kid, sort of thing. It's because it's that infers that it was better just because you have a nostalgic, thing to it. It's possible that previous generations to mine, it's not, I don't want to be connected to me. This has nothing to do with ego. This has to do with my lived experience per se. I think we can see several generations actually before mine. And you could see that some of them acted well in the moment. They sacrificed to a degree, but they also um, there was a balance, or they just made have lived through their times with a degree more integrity in a smarter way than others did. And I think we could judge the generations. I think we can. If you go back, say, to World War One, Victorians and Edwardians, and how badly they mismanaged their time. And these were not dumb folks, but they blew it bad. In a way that there was downstream stuff for future folks. So you know, I, I'm saying all that to get to the point that I'm watching. We're living in a mess, right? And it's a mess everywhere, and it's all falling apart. And a lot of it is institutional. That the institutions, the folks that had the positions, that were in the institutions, that could have done something right, could have stepped up, time and time and time again, sit there and go, well, I'm just really worried about me. What's this got to do with the Times and the recent music review? Well, I really do think they're connected. Standards start to fall, and I've been watching standards fall a good part of my life. Again, not necessarily the result of my generation neither being the defender nor the worst offender in making this happen, but boomers and some of those folks before, the generation before, sort of not totally living up to it, and it just, that became the way people increasingly, it got, the standards were lowered, more and more people behaving badly to a point where it falls apart and the standards aren't there anymore. That's where we're at now, where things that used to be fairly rock solid in the institutional sense, and now we're getting to the New York Times. Okay, we're getting there. There was a time, right, when the Times was like the New York Post, and they've all been, corporate interests have come in and they've turned into, they're gone. Little vestiges of it remain, but it's basically, in many ways, those things are gone, which are really harmful. And because, maybe this is one of the benefits of this, my advanced dotage, is that you have the perspective to see just how damaging that can be. When you're living through it, it's hard to, necessarily know. I think there were a lot of things happening when I was younger when we weren't necessarily aware of it, and we can't really blame us. I don't blame any. There's never going to be, from me, a lot of blame on young people. Young people are fine. Young people get what other generations have sort of done to them. We haven't done very well by the current crowd, so I'm not knocking the current crowd at all. They're trying to figure it out just like everybody else. No problem with them. But let's go back to the Times. The Times did a piece on the greatest living American songwriters. Okay. And they left out a whole ton of people that you would think almost automatically would be on the list. Now, I'm not a songwriter per se, but I'm a musically educated person. And I think a ton of people who are, at first, I think the first reaction to this was just to sit there and go, boy, okay, those are some unusual decisions. What's this based on? Who's making the, and it's when I think for a lot of us, we start to make that, just not dismissing it out of hand, saying, okay, certainly provocative, boy, this doesn't look right at all, but it's the New York Times, right? And major publication, and certainly they could hire, you would think, expert musical people. Who are these folks? Well, what do they, why, by what, how do they come to these conclusions? Joni Mitchell's not there? Okay. Billy Joel's not there. Oh, they don't like Billy Joel? I'm not crazy about Billy Joel. I'm not a fan. Guy could write a tune. It's pretty obvious, right? I've heard some folks, well, he hasn't written anything in 30 years. I thought it was American and living. Okay, he's living. I don't care if he hasn't written anything in 30 years. Really tough. Anyway, so I started to look into who are these folks. And one of the things I liked, I mentioned Rick Beato earlier. So I liked so much about what Rick did is Rick was like, okay, who are these guys? It strikes me as exactly the right question. And he found that there were a number of them, but there was a companion podcast they did, because once there was a lot of outrage, and this says a lot. There was a companion podcast to say, how dare you question us? That gets ugly when you realize what their background is. And this is where it gets tricky, and I think it gets interesting, but I think that's where the instructive is. These are the people on the podcast. I'll just go with that. Those four people, was a senior editor. She's Princeton, bright as it can get. And the music reviewers, three of them I think were there. I think two were Yale and one was Harvard. I might be wrong about that. But they were all Ivy League. And all, as you would expect, bright people. Really bright people. And none of them have a music background. With all that education, They didn't go to music school. They don't write it. They don't play it. They are essentially, they're listeners. And that's it. It's a problem. I can't think. Would you for a second discuss architecture or high art or name a subject if you didn't have, right, the requisite education and degree? You'd probably be at least careful in how you spoke about it, right? You'd be humble to a degree, right? The right thing to do is you'd be somewhat humble. This doesn't mean you can't have an opinion. Of course you can. Absolutely fine. But it's a matter of tone. You would not say, I here up on high. I think you'd be careful about that. I think even people with all of the requisite education and experience and so forth would also be humble. Even talking within their own field, sit there and go, no, you may disagree. Now, others may know better than I. Be very careful about that, right? And what you'll see from these folks is there's none of that. They don't have a background in the area. So they don't do it. They've never done it. They have no real experience there. I mean, I'm sure one of them maybe wrote a 3-chord tune at one point. But I'm saying, I don't think, although I doubt that even happened. But that's part of what is so wild about this. I can't think of any other field that you would do that in. But these guys got hired by the Times. And they're convinced they've got it. In fact, it was amazing on the, I thought they embarrassed themselves badly. They came off very poorly. It came off very, how dare, I'm questioned? How can I be questioned? And they were laughing at people making comments. For instance, one guy said, I went to Berklee College of Music and I had my bum and made some very cogent comments. He looked up and scoffed. I didn't go to Berklee, no. Maybe he should have. I did. Got a good education, too. New England Conservatory, North Texas State, Manhattan, Juilliard. There's tons of good. I'm missing it, I'm missing 78 great musical institutions, right? But, you can get a good music education. And it doesn't mean that everything you say is perfect or anything like that, but does it give you a little bit of a step up? How could it not, right? It's going to help you. And I think people who do, it's why I think when Beato makes a comment, he taught at Ithaca College and, he's had all sorts of gigs. He's produced records. He's been involved. And I don't care what your degree of involvement is, because it's a very hard area to be, right? Music's impossible. You went to one of those schools and you've had some gigs and you've been out, you've played some. You've got every right. You're certainly more of a right than someone who has no musical background. You get something for that expertise. We would say that, right? Do you go to a doctor or do you go see the guy, rattling beads? That education means something. You want legal advice? I hope you're getting a good lawyer. Any of these people who, we all have an expertise, hopefully, in something. We want scientific expertise. I hope you're talking to people with a rigorous scientific background. You want to understand physics? I hope you're talking to some physicists. But if we're talking about popular music, no, it's just, I've got these vibes and I feel as if, and a lot of their criticism, which I found interesting, had very little to do with even the work itself. It had to deal with how the work was perceived in the culture. So they were really much more cultural critics That seemed to be what they were interested in. They were much more interested in that than anything. Now, I know, you sit there and go, you can get two nuts and bolts, Dave. And, I agree, it can get two nuts and bolts. And so there is a balance to be achieved, right? You don't want to become, well, look, you could accuse these folks fairly of being dilettantes. A lot of passion and not a lot of knowledge. And the opposite, obviously, right? It goes that route where it becomes all about technique and purity, and that's a problem too, right? That extreme is also a problem. But that's not what we're talking about here. And a criticism of what's going on at the times isn't coming from that extreme pedantic wing. Someone really in the middle could see the issue with the pedantic and could see the issue with the dilettante. Someone with that balance can see what's going on at the times. I think it's sit there and go, oh my God, this is a problem. And it speaks to, and I think it does speak to deeper things. Those folks it's an embarrassment to see people that bright who should know better. And I think that's part of it. I have family that was Ivy League. I've known a number of folks, I know plenty of Ivy League people actually. And I don't have a bad opinion that way. But there's almost nothing worse than being that bright and then having that much of a blind spot, basically due to hubris. I've talked about that crowd and how bright they are, and I do. I loved visiting friends at Ivy League schools because I love just how the level was so high, the high tide rises all boats. It was just amazing. And as bright as it was, don't think for a minute that you can't hang. I think they're amazing and the processing power is stupendous, but don't think you can't hang with these people, because you certainly can. And I know a number of people, I could think of some interesting examples, people who went to not the top universities, right? A good university, but not Ivy League, say, who put in the same work environment with Ivy Leaguers, ended up doing better than the Ivy Leaguers to some degree through just hard work and being a little more connected to the real world, and that could help. So the Times piece was incredibly ugly. I think we've gotten to a point though where a lot of the stuff has to be dismissed. You can't take these guys seriously. It's amazing that anyone would do a piece with lists like that, because there's something to be learned from here. There is so much garbage all over YouTube. Virtually everything is, right? The crazy headline to get you to click, the clickbait headline, right? The outrageous claims that they can't really make, or they make and then can't really prove. And the backlash, I'm hoping there will be one at some point, that you see a little bit of this going on in media right now, where good reporters are leaving CNN or The Times or what's now MS Now, and they're substacking. There's now an independent media movement because of how, where there are actual standards, because the individuals have actual standards. I'm thinking of Alex Wagner is a great example. MS Now, what was MSNBC, never quite knew what to do with her. And I remember right after the 2020 election, She was on the air sitting there going, you know, what's going on here? They're not, you know, they're not making, the Justice Department isn't making any moves here. What are they doing? Why are we taking time on this? They just don't, they want it all to just go away. You know, she had it down what was going to happen for the next 4 years within the first few months of the Biden presidency. Corporate media didn't know what to do with her. I mean, she was actually getting it right. So, you know, to some degree, I think you need to watch what's going on out there to keep the receipts. See who does get it right over the long, to play the long game. And I think you see just how bad it is. It's scary bad. We're gonna have to rebuild all of this. And what can you do as an individual, right? I run into it. I run into it quite a bit, and I'll just go into musical circles. I run into, it's gotten to a point where there's so much BS online about what's going on and the degree that it is going on musically. There isn't that much going on. There isn't that much that's that good. And little scenes of people fighting it out with other little scenes of people. I'll give you an example. I saw recently, because my son just got out of college, and I'm like, dude, we gotta go, let's go see some concerts, let's go do some stuff. He's got an internship this summer, so I've only got like 6 weeks to let's do some stuff. And I saw that Ron Carter, the legendary bass player, was playing at the Blue Note for his 89th birthday. Oh my God. Ron Carter may be the most recorded jazz bassist, I believe he is, of all time. He was in Miles's band in the 60s, man. Ron is, Ron. And I'm like, you know what? I wondered if it would be okay, if the gig would be good, because it was its advanced age and all that. But I said, let's go. And I hadn't been to the Blue Note in years. And I go to the Blue Note, and the Blue Note hasn't changed. It's still the Blue Note. Great. And we go, and we listen. And my son asked one of his besties who's musically interested, do you want to go along? The guy said, yeah. So great. I got 2 guys, 19 and 20, myself. We're going to the Blue Note. And I tried to give them a little bit of, this is what, just what are you going to go see? So it just wasn't an incomprehensible mess for them. So they'd understand, that there's this thing called a form, and they're going to play the body of the tune, and then we're going to solo over those changes. That's how the music develops, and it's going to happen live in front of you. There's not going to be any music. They got it. Amazing thing. And it was a great show. Band was fantastic. And it makes you think, gee, what's the jazz scene like in New York City? And I started to dig around, and it turns into, we were talking earlier about the land of pedantry and the land of dilettantism. There's a heavy pedantic, super insular jazz scene, which I always was, as a jazz person, was always a little worried about. Guys, and it remains this very, people playing for nothing, playing these daggers out all the time. They all can't stand each other. They're all fighting each other. They're convinced they're holding up this music. To some degree they are, but also only they know within that scene who the other players even are. I think most of it, I'm interested in jazz. I don't know who these folks are. I know that they're very, very good players. I'm not knocking that. But part of what we should be doing should be some outreach. We have a responsibility to educate folks as to what things can be, instead of pushing them away and going into their little scene. And I really don't have any interest in it. There's nothing really terribly original going on there, for one. And I mean, they're all about themselves. It's just, It is, music has not changed, music has not grown, and it's a pissing contest about who can outpure each other. And that's what it seems like. I don't see new ideas and new voices per se. Um, I just see it staying like like an animal on the treadmill. It just keeps going round and round. But it's not to knock the playing, but it's gotta escape from that, be a little bit more of a actual force other than just a scene of really good cats who just hang in. I don't think that's the answer musically. I know it's not for me. I'd love to play jazz again, but I don't. And I'm actually kind of looking around, but it will. I won't. I don't need the imprimatur of those cats, who I think are getting it wrong. And I think that's kind of freeing. So I think, there's a lot going on. I'm thinking about this, and there's all these extremes, and it's so splintered. You go from the Times guys, who aren't even musical people, who are lording it over folks and are very upset that anyone disagrees with them on everything. After all, they got a degree in comparative studies and you've got super intense musical people that have gone into a black hole somewhere and talked to nobody. That they're convinced they've got it right and they're pissed off. And you've got this online scene full of people, and again, a lot of anger. There's virtually nothing you can say here where you don't get attacked by somebody. And I think that's part of it. There's a wonderful trumpet player out there in New York City named Bob Spellman. Oh, I think Bobby Spellman's great. And he has his, I apologize, I don't recalling the name of the site offhand. Trumpet with Bob, I think, is the name of the thing. And he does these educational videos, and they're great. Good. He seems like a sweet cat, and he's got a really good musical background. He plays great. It's fine. And he talked about, and he really understands the instrument. He's a very refreshing cat, and did a video about the way breathing works, and he was talking to a physicist. They really got into the weeds on it's. Listen, if you're into this stuff and you're a player, you like this stuff, great. And there was a commenter that actually couldn't hold himself back about, I've got this degree and I know this and you don't know what you're talking about. And I know these people say, well, it's the internet, Dave. I know. And that's kind of the problem. It needs a lot of, it's broken. This is a broken scene. And I think the reaction, maybe that's where all this is coming from, right? When you distill all this and it's all broken, then you really don't have a responsibility to pay too much attention to it. You do your best to stay informed. You do your best to not lower your standards, keep trying to raise your standards, do something, but you do something that you can live with and you think is good. And whether that receives the approbation of the big indifferent machine, whether that's music industry, good Lord, that's a disaster too, right? Really almost isn't that all that important. It would be nice to have a professional success here and there. Those are always nice. But in the end, there's got to be a balance between, and we're not going to find it by looking at the internet. It'll never give you that. So I think there is something to be said for putting the phones away and there's a place for it. Definitely a place for it. There's all sorts of good stuff, but at the extremes of it are really bad. And those are the things we have to really mute and turn down increasingly, and reward what we see is, half decent. I think the fact that Beato's been successful is great news. It shows that it is possible. But there's tons of people doing great stuff who just right? Nobody knows. No one. It just doesn't get picked up, and algorithmically, it doesn't work for whatever reason. But that's not a reason to say, well, it doesn't have enough views. Well, then it's okay. In fact, I think to some degree it's a compliment when you consider what a disaster the culture is. You know, maybe the guys, playing at the tiny little clubs and, forgetting that there's a public. Maybe they've got a point. Maybe that's the way to go. But I think there's something to be said for. I don't think that's true. I think it's a little too intentional. I think it's a little too this. I think that's one of my big problems with those folks. They are there's so much of the look how pure I am, and you have to love me, and if you don't, you're an idiot who just doesn't get it. Nobody has to. Anyway, there's a lot of issues out there, and I wish I could, put a bow on it, right? And we could all wrap this up. I think they're interconnected, but this is the next step of this culture will have to get away from the tech bros and tech broness. We're gonna have to find another way. What we consume, what we give our attention to, and dealing with or instead of by reputation, since things are so broken, thinking things are just going to go back the way they were. Right? It's like watching the stock market. Stock market isn't and hasn't been for some time an indicator of much of anything, economically or otherwise. It's just what a bunch of kind of crazy gamblers are doing with the money. So, and since that's now a truth, at least for now, then we have to go with that. And I think we have to start doing that more and more and more, since things are so broken. And for media, lots of Substack would probably be a good idea. Go find folks where you can. But yeah, I think it's time for, I think there is a shift, and I think there needs to be a lot more of it. And there's nothing wrong with it. You said, well, I feel so hopeless. I think everybody does. But that doesn't mean you don't keep doing the right thing in your own life, in your own way. And if you're a creative person, do the creative stuff and stop worrying about, well, this one says this and that one says this, and then forget it. It's not helpful. But it's also important to note what a mess it is out there and identify it and not let them get away with it, right? You got to call it out. It may not come to anything, but for your own sanity, and if you can get that word out there to 12 guys, fine. Then you told 12 guys, great. But that mess at the Times, they can't get that right. What else are they getting wrong? I'm guessing probably everything. They couldn't even hire musical people. They didn't even think of that. How lost is that group? And the smart people who should know better, the responsibility is so much more because they've gotten that great education to be that, I don't know, clueless and all about themselves. Yeah. They deserve what's coming to them. So there are some thoughts, and I'll go about my way. I got music to make. I've got to do my thing, and I'm cool with that. Talk to you guys. Peace.